are American companies doing business in Europe actually doing these days? Well, we caught up with someone here at the European Business Summit in Brussels who can tell us. He's Mark Spelman, and he's the actual chairman of the Executive Council of the American Chamber of Commerce. And your day job is the global head of strategy for Accenture.
Correct.
And as such, you cooperated with us in doing the research report that was released here.
That's right.
First, I want you to put on your American Chamber of Commerce hat, the EU and the US. What is that trading situation? I know it's a very important one, and is it improving?
Yeah. Well, I think the important thing to remember is that when you look at global trade, the US-European Union trade sort of balances are just absolutely fundamental. If you look, for example, at the American Chamber of Commerce, we have 140 companies, American companies, operating in Europe. That represents something like 4.8 million jobs, over $1.2 trillion worth of investments cumulatively into Europe. And I think what we sort of recognize is that if you look at the US and Europe combined, it's still a very significant part of global GDP. And a lot of sort of R&D efforts are done in that particular sort of part of the world. Now, that doesn't mean that Asia isn't important. It clearly is, because all these companies now are increasingly global, but Europe is really a very important sort of base. And I think the other important thing to say is that with 500 million people, it is still a really critical market to get right in.
What about the economic crisis and its impact on American companies? I mean, what were some of the first things that you saw? And do you think that it's beginning to, I hate to use the word recover because I think we jumped into it too soon, but are things at least stabilizing?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that what American companies see is, and I'm not sure this is necessarily an American-specific thing, but we see a multi-speed recovery. And so what you get is a sort of recognition that different economies are in different states of recovery. I think actually even within Europe, different countries have basically suffered more or less badly as a result of the downturn. So if you look at a country like Poland, for example, Poland actually has fared reasonably well through the crisis, and clearly other countries like Greece and Spain, Portugal, Ireland have had much more difficult times. So the message for companies is that you have to pick your spots. So it's all about, I think, a combination of looking at where the growth spots are, with still managing costs and avoiding too much complexity in your business model.
One theme that we've heard here, and was also in the report that Accenture and Insead put together, with funding from Shell and Microsoft, so we just make sure they're happy too,
right.
Was that small and medium-sized companies, SMEs, are actually going to be leading the recovery.
Yep.
And that's not been an easy thing in Europe, where mostly bank credits have been the way to capital.
Yeah.
How are SMEs, the creation thereof and the fostering thereof, how is that being fostered or created in Europe, and what role does AmCham play in it?
Well, I think the critical thing to remember in Europe is that 2/3 of all jobs come through small, medium-sized enterprises. And if you look at the relative size of, let's say, small, medium-sized enterprises in Europe relative to the United States, the average one in the United States has 19 people. The one in the average size in Europe has something like 9 people. So if you can improve the employment prospects, then you start addressing some of the fundamentals. Now, if you look at what the small, medium enterprises are basically saying, the critical issues are basically bureaucracy. It's too much in terms of sort of having to administer and do business.
And there's no break for a startup for the most part.
And the other big problem, I think, is the lack of financing and lack of credit, particularly for smaller companies. And I think the other fundamental thing in Europe is that there's still a culture that there's a price of failure. And if you compare that to Asia, where in fact sort of 70 to 80% of people will actually aspire to set up companies, that's only about 10 to 20% in Europe. And I think we have to work so much harder here in terms of convincing people actually setting up a business is a good thing to do. But I think the conditions have got to be right to be able to set up your business. And you need to be able to have, I think, some distinctive skills. You need to have access to finance, and it needs to be reasonably easy to do. And I think more needs to be done to be able to provide that catalyst.
Now, the report itself talked about, again, SMEs being important, and Europe could recover stronger and other such things. I mean, did this make sense to you? As you're in your global head of strategy,
right?
Were there any surprises in the report for you?
Well, I think that what the report basically focused on was pace. And one of the things I think that's very interesting in today's sort of world is that in some ways that the downturn has not sort of slowed things down. In some ways it's actually accelerated what's been going on there. And I think this this notion of how do we get more pace, particularly into the European market. It was an interesting sort of feature that came out of it. I think that the other, interesting focus was very much around innovation. Actually, what you need is the ecosystem. So you need big companies working with smaller companies, and those coming together, particularly with people like venture capitalists and academia working together. I think the one thing that did surprise me was that if you actually looked at the clusters, particularly the innovation clusters in Europe, they tend to be very small. And that what we actually need to do is network them more effectively, not only within Europe, but also into other parts of the world, whether that's into the United States and into Asia. And I think one of the problems with a lot of the debate about Europe is that it's very insular. And where I think the whole debate is going, particularly as I put my global hat on, is actually it's about Europe being much more effective in terms of partnerships and collaboration with other parts of the world. And so I think Europe actually needs to get out and sell Europe more, particularly in Asia, and really be out there and sort of convincing, for example, the 91 out of the top 500 companies which are multinationals in emerging markets, the largest emerging market multinationals, that they need to be in Europe, big time.
Let me ask you to leave your global hat on for just a minute
Right.
while I ask you the last question, which is what your outlook for global trade, and what kind of, if you were a big company or even a small company wanting to do well in this environment, what would your strategy be? What's your outlook for global trade?
So I think if I look at where we are on the global economy, I think Europe is in the 1 to 2% range in terms of GDP growth. The United States is in the 2 to 3% range, and Asia is in the 5 to 8% range. And I think recognizing that actually business models, I think, are going to change very dramatically. The volume of data in the world is doubling in the next 18 months. There's a huge amounts of new computing power coming on stream. And so I think what we're seeing is a trend towards more interdependence on the global stage, plus some huge changes in terms of technology. These are going to change people's business models. So the strategy you have to get right is you've got to be super global and super local. You've got to take the scale advantages of being global, and you've got to really understand local customer needs in distinct geographies and then be able to target those very effectively. So if you get the benefits of scale and the benefits of specialization, and you can make that happen without putting too much complexity in, I think you're going to win.
That sounds like quite a challenge. Thank you very much, Mark Spelman, for being with us on Insead Knowledge.
Pleasure.